That can't be right.
Upon first glance, this may appear to be a completely normal PS1, but some eagle-eyed viewers may have noticed the HDMI port in place of the original AV output. That's because inside this console is anything but normal. In today's video, you're going to see exactly what it takes to turn this old console into an awesome sleeper emulation machine. Spoiler alert, not everything went exactly to plan. Before I could get started, I needed to source a donor console. So after wasting my time on the cesspit that is Facebook Marketplace, I turned to eBay, where I found this listing for only $55. It was almost perfect since it included all of the original cords and the controller. I say almost perfect because the controller looks like this, but that's alright, we can fix that later. And here it is, a perfectly working PlayStation console. Let's change that, starting with the 6 Phillips head screws holding the case together. After pulling the top cover off, I could start removing all the components from the console, starting with the CD laser assembly, followed by the controller ports, which are held in with 2 Phillips head screws. Then it was time to remove the main board. After removing the metal shield, I could finally remove the remaining screws and pull the board out. After removing the metal shield, I could remove the power supply, being careful not to touch any of the capacitors since I wasn't sure if they were still charged or not. We'll be using this later. After giving the case a quick cleaning, I decided I would reinstall the controller port assembly since I knew I would need to take it into consideration when figuring out where to put all of the components later. Once I decided where I was going to mount everything, I needed to trim the case a bit to make space for the Raspberry Pi and power supply. Now for some fun stuff. One of the things I wanted to do in this build was to have the controller ports be fully functional. For that, I bought a couple of these USB to PlayStation controller adapters on Amazon. I started by removing the adapter board from the enclosure and desoldering the USB cable and controller connector. Next, I could place the controller adapters in the enclosure using double-sided foam tape. I then cut all of the bulk off of the USB connector and desoldered the wires. I then soldered 4 wires in place of the original USB cable. I started to do the same process off camera for the second adapter board, but I made a huge mistake. As I was tinning the pads in preparation of installing the wires, I managed to rip 3 pads off of the board. Bruh. Luckily, I was able to salvage it by scraping away some of the solder mask using an X-Acto knife and soldering directly to the copper traces. Then, just in case, I hot glued all the wires to make sure none of them would get snagged and risk pulling another pad off the board. After avoiding that disaster, which could have set me back a whole $8, it was time to start working on the power supply. This is where the project gets a bit more interesting because I'm going to be doing something a little unconventional here. I started by scoring the power supply board right above the reset switch. Then, I snapped it in half. This will make more sense later, I promise. Next, I had to remove all of the internal electronics from the official 27-watt Raspberry Pi wall adapter. This turned out to be a little bit harder than I first anticipated. Instead of wasting all day and giving myself carpal tunnel trying to cut the enclosure open with a pair of side cutters, I decided I would take the riskier and much easier approach. So I pulled out my trusty rotary tool and cut the rest of the enclosure, being careful not to hit any of the electronics with a cutoff wheel. After all the electronics were removed from the case, I tested all the capacitors off camera to make sure none of them were holding any charge. Once I confirmed the board was safe to handle, I removed the USB cable. I did this so I could shorten the cable to the exact length it would need to be for a cleaner look. After that, I removed the AC socket from the PS1's power supply board. I then connected it to the AC inputs on the Pi's power adapter board. And this is where the power supply board that I snapped in half earlier comes in. I wanted to reuse the original power switch, so I figured the easiest way to do that would be to remove all of the unused components from the board. I then roughly placed all of the electronics into the enclosure so that I could figure out where to cut the USB cable once again, this time cutting it right where it meets the power switch. Then I mended the positive and negative wires back together so that I could solder the green wire to the legs for the power switch on the underside of the board. This is the wire that's used to tell the power supply to send power when it receives a signal from the Pi. Then I mounted the power supply adapter and AC plug using this 3D printed bracket that I designed. I also wanted to maintain functionality of the original green power LED. For this, I needed to solder 2 wires as well as a 220 ohm resistor. Then I ran those wires to the positive and negative terminals on the DC output of the Pi's power adapter. With the power supply sorted out, I wanted to have a full-size HDMI port in place of the original AV connector. For this, I bought a micro HDMI to female HDMI adapter. I needed to remove the connector from the housing, otherwise it would have been too thick to fit in the original port opening. I figured the best way to do this would be to cut away at it using a box cutter. After removing all of the rubber molding around the port, I found out that there was a plastic sleeve around the connector that could just slide off, which ended up being really convenient because I could just design an adapter plate with an HDMI cutout. After printing it out, I could simply slip the connector into the cutout and screw the adapter in place where the original AV connector used to sit. I also printed out this blanking plate to cover the opening where the serial connector used to be. Finally, it was time to mount the heart of this build. In order to mount the Raspberry Pi, I designed this super simple mount. I plugged in the power and HDMI cables to ensure I mount the Pi in a spot where they can both reach. Then I used some super glue to attach the mount to the enclosure. After removing the Raspberry Pi, I ran a bead of glue around the perimeter of the mount. Now I can finally put this thing together. Wait, I forgot to install an operating system.
Bruh.
Installing an operating system was incredibly easy using the Raspberry Pi Imager tool. I settled on Recalbox as RetroPie isn't officially supported on the Raspberry Pi 5 yet. I've never used Recalbox before, so it was a bit of a learning curve for me, but once I eventually figured it out, I think I actually may like it a little bit better than RetroPie. But before I can play anything, there's just one last thing that needs to be done. The controller that was included with this console is fully functional, but it's super crusty and the thumbsticks are in terrible condition. Let's fix that. Back at the workbench, I started by removing the 7 Phillips head screws from the bottom of the controller. Then I removed the screws holding in the main board. I removed all the components from the controller so that I could give them a good cleaning. Now, I want to focus my attention on these thumbsticks. Luckily for me, I had a bunch of these analog breakout boards which have a thumbstick that just so happens to fit the PS1 controller. Once that was sorted out, I could start reassembling the controller. Now, let's see what this thing can do. I'm so happy with the way this project turned out. But honestly, if I were to do it over again, I would probably use one of those mini Ryzen PCs so that I could emulate the 6th generation consoles. Maybe in the future, I'll have to give that a try. So if you like this build, be sure to leave a like down below so I can know you're interested in this type of content. But with that being said, that's all I have for this one. If you have any suggestions for future content, be sure to let me know down in the comments below. If you want to see more content like this, hit that bell icon and get subscribed so you won't miss any future videos. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Later.